All right, so you've given me quite the stack of articles here, all about the U.S. trade deficit and President Trump's tariffs in early 2025.
Definitely seems like we've got a real economic puzzle on our hands here.
Yeah, a record trade deficit and a president who, is definitely not afraid to use tariffs.
And it's going to impact businesses, jobs, even just, the cost of things we buy every day.
Exactly. So let's break it down and try to understand what the future might hold here.
Sounds good.
All right, well, first thing that jumped out at me was this number, a $1.2 trillion U.S. trade deficit in 2024.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a record. So what does that even mean in the grand scheme of things? What is a trade deficit?
So the trade deficit is basically the difference between how much a country imports, buys from other countries, and how much it exports, sells to other countries.
Okay, so we're buying more than we're selling.
Exactly. In this case, the U.S. imported $4.1 trillion worth of goods and services last year, but only exported $3.2 trillion.
Wow, so that gap right there, that's the deficit.
And it's been growing for years.
So it seems like America is on a bit of a shopping spree.
You could say that.
And it's no wonder President Trump is concerned.
Right.
He's never been shy about his views on trade and how he sees the trade deficit as a sign of weakness.
Definitely a sign that other countries are taking advantage of the U.S.
And it seems like he's ready to take action.
His moves in early February 2025 definitely reflect that view, slapping tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China. That's a pretty bold move.
So he's putting these tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and he says it's about, drugs and immigration.
Right.
But he's also tying it to this trade deficit.
Oh, for sure. This is nothing new for him, though.
Yeah.
President Trump has always viewed trade through this lens of winning and losing.
Well, and speaking of winning and losing, let's talk about China for a second. They seem to always be at the center of these trade disputes.
Absolutely.
So how do they fit into this puzzle?
Well, they have a record trade surplus of nearly $1 trillion.
A surplus?
Yeah, meaning they're selling far more to the world than they're buying.
Okay, so the opposite of what we're doing.
Pretty much. Yeah. It's this global imbalance that's fueling a lot of the tension we're seeing.
And on February 4th, President Trump raised tariffs on Chinese goods by 10%.
And China filed a complaint with the World Trade Organization right away.
Oh.
Calling the tariffs discriminatory and protectionist.
So it sounds like we're on the verge of a trade war here, but do these tariffs actually work? I mean, is this the right approach to reducing the deficit?
That's the million-dollar question, and there's a lot of debate about it.
So what are the arguments on both sides?
Well, some economists, like Stephen Miran, who often supports President Trump's policies, they argue that tariffs can be a good tool.
Oh, so?
Well, they think tariffs can help to offset macroeconomic imbalances, bring in revenue for the government and give the U.S. more leverage in these trade negotiations.
So they think it gives us more power.
Yeah, exactly. But on the other hand, you have experts like Maurice Obstfeld.
Who's that?
He's a former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund.
Oh, okay.
And he argues that tariffs could actually backfire and make things worse.
Really? How so?
Well, he and others suggest that tariffs might actually strengthen the U.S. dollar.
Which is good, right?
Well, not necessarily. Because a stronger dollar makes imported goods cheaper, since you can buy more foreign currency with the same amount of dollars.
I see. So our stuff costs more overseas, but their stuff costs less here.
Exactly, and that can actually hurt American businesses.
So it's not just a simple matter of putting a tariff on something and expecting it to fix everything.
Right. There are all sorts of complex economic factors at play here. Things like currency fluctuations and interest rates.
Yeah, it's all connected.
Exactly like a giant game of chess, where each move has ripple effects across the whole board. It's fascinating, but it makes it really hard to predict what will happen in the end.
So we've got this trade war brewing, fueled by these record deficits and surpluses, and we're starting to see some of the consequences play out, like with China and this whole debate about tariffs. But what does it all mean for us, the average person? How might these actions actually play out in the real world?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, because it's not just numbers anymore. It starts to impact real people in their lives.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Take Sheartex, a Canadian company that makes tights. They had to temporarily lay off 40% of their workforce, almost 350 people, because of the uncertainty these tariffs created. They just don't know what the future holds for their business, and they had to make some tough choices.
Wow. So these are the real-world consequences.
Yeah, and it's just one example of how this is affecting people.
So we're seeing the impact on businesses and workers, but what about consumers like us? What should we be prepared for?
That's a good point. It's easy to think of this as just numbers, But there are real people who are being affected by this.
Yeah, exactly. And this is just one example of the uncertainty businesses are facing. When costs increase because of tariffs, it really messes with their plans.
Right.
They might have to raise prices, which could hurt their sales, or they might have to cut costs, which often means layoffs. Yeah, tough choices all around. Okay, so we've got this uncertainty factor, but let's not forget President Trump also put tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Right. Citing concerns about drugs and migrants. What's the story there?
Well, those tariffs have caused their own issues. Canada especially feels targeted after the SheerTech situation.
I can see why.
It's important to remember that these trade relationships are incredibly complex and interconnected.
Yeah, one thing affects another.
Exactly. When one country makes a move, it triggers this chain reaction across global markets.
And those reactions are not always predictable.
Definitely not. It's a delicate balance.
So if these tariffs aren't like the magic solution to the trade deficit, what are the alternatives? What else can be done to address these global imbalances?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And there are a few different schools of thought out there.
Like what?
Some experts, like Michael Pettis, who we mentioned before, suggest a more collaborative approach.
Oh.
He argues that forming a coalition with other countries to pressure China to change its trade practices could be more effective than going it alone with tariffs.
So strength in numbers.
Exactly. He thinks a united front would give these countries more power, more bargaining power, and increase the chances of actually making a change.
Okay, I see. But wouldn't it be hard to form a coalition like that, especially with all the global tension going on?
It definitely wouldn't be easy. But Pettis believes that working together is the best way to create a more balanced and sustainable trade system for everyone.
So that's one option, team up and try to negotiate better terms. What other ideas are out there?
Well, another approach focuses on domestic economic policies. Instead of trying to control trade flows with tariffs, the focus is on strengthening the U.S. economy from within.
So kind of like looking inward instead of out.
Exactly. People who support this approach say the U.S. should be focusing on boosting domestic savings, investing in education and infrastructure, and promoting innovation, making the U.S. more competitive on the world stage.
So instead of trying to control what's coming in and out, we focus on making what we produce here even better.
Precisely. And of course, some experts believe that a combination of approaches is needed. A mix of international collaboration, domestic policy reforms, and maybe even some carefully targeted trade measures.
So no easy answers.
No, not really. It's a complex issue with no one-size-fits-all solution.
It sounds like we need some really strategic thinking and open communication between countries to figure this out.
Absolutely. And it's important to move away from this idea that trade is a zero-sum game where one country wins and the other loses.
Yeah, that seems to be a common theme these days.
It is, and it's a dangerous way of thinking because a global economy where everyone is struggling doesn't benefit anyone.
True. It's interesting how much this conversation mirrors what's happening in politics.
It really does.
Yeah.
This whole winning versus losing mentality is everywhere.
It is. And I think it highlights how important it is to look beyond these simplistic narratives.
Couldn't agree more. True economic prosperity comes from working together, not fighting against each other.
So finding ways to leverage each other's strengths and creating a system that works for everyone.
Exactly. That's the goal.
Okay, so let's take a step back and recap what we've learned so far in our deep dive into the U.S. trade deficit and President Trump's actions.
Sounds good.
We started by talking about that record-breaking trade deficit, which hit $1.2 trillion in 2024, driven by a surge in imports and slower export growth.
Right.
And then we talked about President Trump's belief that the trade deficit is a sign of weakness and his decision to impose tariffs on Canada, Mexico, and China.
And how he sees this as a way to protect American jobs and businesses. But we also discussed the influence of advisors like Peter Navarro, who thinks that the U.S. has been taken advantage of on the global stage.
And we dug into China's response to those tariffs, including their complaint to the WTO, and explored those differing viewpoints on whether tariffs are even effective at fixing the trade deficit. We also talked about some possible alternative solutions like forming coalitions and focusing on domestic economic policies.
It's becoming clear that this whole situation really shows how interconnected the global economy is and how actions taken by one country can have unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's like a ripple effect.
Exactly. And it highlights how important it is to understand not just the economic impact of trade policy, but also the geopolitical impact.
So it's a lot bigger than just the numbers.
It really is.
You mentioned earlier that these trade actions could have real-world consequences beyond just the numbers.
Right.
Can you talk more about that? What are some of the things that could happen because of this?
Well, we already talked about how this is creating uncertainty for businesses,
Right.
but we also have to think about the impact on consumers.
Like,
If businesses have to pay more for imported goods because of tariffs, they're likely to raise prices for consumers.
so things could get more expensive for us.
Yeah, pretty much. Everything from groceries to clothes to electronics could cost more.
Wow, that's a big deal. So this is not just some abstract economic thing. It could directly affect our wallets.
Exactly. And that's just one potential consequence.
Are there other downsides we should be aware of?
Well, one big concern is retaliation.
What do you mean?
If the U.S. puts tariffs on other countries, they might respond by putting their own tariffs on U.S. goods.
Oh, I see. So it could escalate quickly.
Exactly. It could turn into a trade war where everyone is trying to protect their own interests and ends up hurting everyone in the process.
That doesn't sound good.
It's not. And it's important to remember that the global trading system is built on a complex web of agreements and relationships.
Yeah, it's all connected.
Right. When one country disrupts that system, it creates a ripple effect that's hard to predict or control.
So what kind of ripple effect are we talking about?
Well, we could see disruptions to supply chains, shortages of certain goods, and even a decline in global investment.
So there's a lot at stake here. It seems like it goes way beyond economics.
Absolutely. These trade disputes can also have political and diplomatic consequences.
How so?
Trade policy is closely tied to foreign policy. When countries disagree about trade, it can strain their relationships and make it harder for them to cooperate on other important issues like security, climate change, or global health.
So it affects everything.
It really does. And that's why it's so crucial to understand how complex these issues are. There are no simple answers, and the decisions made today will have long-lasting consequences.
Wow, you've really given us a lot to think about. It's clear that this whole trade deficit thing and President Trump's tariffs are just one part of a much bigger story, about global trade and economic power. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
And it's definitely not over. It's a dynamic situation that's likely to keep evolving. So it's important to stay informed, to engage in these conversations, and really consider the wider implications of these actions, because it's not just about what's happening today. It's about what kind of world we're building for tomorrow.
Yeah, this deep dive has definitely been eye-opening. It's not just about the numbers. It's about real people's lives and how countries interact and, the entire global economy.
Absolutely. Trade isn't just this abstract concept.
Yeah.
It has real-world consequences, and the choices that leaders make today will have an impact for years to come across borders and even for future generations.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what is the one thing you want our listener to walk away thinking about?
I think the biggest question is, if tariffs aren't the best solution, then what are the alternatives? How can we address these global imbalances? And how might all of this play out in the long run? And how will it affect not just the economy, but also geopolitics and our daily lives?
Those are some really great questions, and I hope our listeners will keep exploring them because there's so much information out there, and this is all constantly changing.
This deep dive has given everyone a good foundation, but the learning shouldn't stop here. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and stay engaged. That's how we navigate this crazy, complex, and constantly changing world.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.